various admissions committees, a little bit about some recommendations and best tips for preparing for your recommendations and for your recommenders. So without further ado, thank you guys for attending today, and I hope that you learned something new throughout this presentation. So just to put a little bit of a face to a name, again, my name is Megan Solinger, admissions at the Carey Business School. I myself did not go to the Carey Business School, but I did go to Hopkins, and I worked several capacities at various divisions of the university and outside of Hopkins in admissions. So I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this presentation. So if you guys have questions about that I can help address, or hopefully that get answered throughout the presentation, feel free to type it into the control panel that you guys all have access to during the presentation. So when you're looking at recommendations, so one of the things to help when thinking about recommendations in the application process is that the admissions committee doesn't ask for things that they don't see a value in considering as part of the admissions process. So recommendations are sort of the first and kind of only place that allows somebody else to provide anecdotes, examples, and really kind of vouch for you and everything else that you've sort of presented to the admissions committee. So a good recommender is somebody that's going to be able to give context, a lot of things that maybe is on your resume or that you've mentioned throughout your application in short answers and in essays. The recommender is also a good recommender, somebody that also can verify skills or experiences that you've had that otherwise you've kind of not been able to elaborate on. And this allows somebody else to add another point of view that you yourself or somebody who's really close to you personally would be a little more biased for or biased out. Usually, a good recommender is somebody that knows you in a different capacity, maybe another recommender. So that's one way to think about recommendation when you're trying to sort of make the short list of who are the best people to ask. Think about people that can add different perspectives and know you in different capacities. And also, a good recommender is somebody that you have a relationship with, obviously, or hopefully people that you ask for to be forthright with you and say, I really don't think I'm the best person to ask. Most people that agree to be a recommender for you, they usually are going to say very positive things about you or constructive things about you. So again, that's something that will really add value to the perspective of you as an applicant when the admission committee is reviewing all the pieces of the puzzle. So one of the things I tell people is ultimately, take a step back and think about how the person can add some value to you and verify that you have been saying or want to say throughout your application. So that's, in my mind, sort of a big picture of what a good recommender is. And we'll get into a couple examples of maybe what some not good or recommenders would be. These are the 6 tips that I'm going to sort of go into a little bit more depth about as we're kind of going through the presentation today. The first one is so the first, I think, probably the most important tip that we'll discuss is about getting organized. Obviously, when you're choosing your recommendations, you want to be very strategic about who you pick, and obviously think about the element of time as you proceed through the entire application process, and when you are linking in somebody else, such as a recommender. Also, if you have the option in the application process to save your right, and obviously this is something that might be a little bit more applicable, it's about being honest and with following up. So these are all important things to consider when preparing for recommenders and your recommendations. So the first thing the important is about getting organized. When you think about the application process, a lot of schools will give you a checklist, but just getting your recommenders or having them submit on your behalf isn't enough. You want to make sure that your recommender knows as much about you, about your experiences, about the program. Want to be very clear about things with them in terms of deadlines, how the whole admission process is laid out for them. So, a couple ways to sort of prepare for dealing directly with your recommenders is making sure that your resume and CV are up to date. Most schools require that you do submit those, so this is a good place to start. This is something you would want to submit or give to your recommender. I wouldn't say this is all to submit. To submit that possibly what I would say a cover letter, lay out that when that recommendation is due. I think one of the important things getting organized is really important is that you are involving someone else in this process. You're not solely relying on yourself. You have to build in for you need to build in for that. You need to be aware of what's going on in their life, be aware of some of their abilities, and so you need to get organized and make this easy for them as possible. So you also follow directions very closely. A lot of time recommendation letters require or are implemented. So and part of it needs to be filled out by you. And so just make sure that everything is complete. Again, as easy as possible for recommender, or in essence, doing you a favor. If recommendations are going to be submitted by U.S. Postal Service or the Postal Service, make sure that you're actually giving them an envelope that is stamped. If it's electronic, make sure they know exactly where they're submitting their recommendation so that things are not open and ambiguous, or you're not leaving it to them to sort of figure out. I know this sort of seems obvious, but you know, like I said before, that these people are doing you a favor, so make sure that you can submit all of this stuff to them up front. So a good way to do this is put a cover letter over your CV or resume with all of this important information. Maybe even highlight exactly when the recommendation to be submitted by, and also how and what ways this is going to be submitted. And also another thing I would include maybe on this cover letter is a little bit about the program or school that you're considering, or a couple of the schools, and also why you're looking at the particular programs that you are, and why you think you would be a good choice for this program, just so that they have a little bit more context and kind of can pick and choose things that and that they know they have observed in you and with you, and things that your resume may be able to also complement as well. This is a really kind of great way to kind of lay everything out for recommender, to make sure you have all the pieces of the puzzle together for your recommender and give it to them. I wouldn't say do stages, but make sure this is the first thing that you do when kind of approaching your recommender so that you seem organized. I would say a good rule of thumb is if you can provide them with 6 weeks of sort of headway, that would be wonderful. And again, my last bullet point that we'll talk about is following up, so you can always kind of keep in touch to make sure that they're on track or haven't forgotten about your recommendation, which is very important. So the second thing we're going to talk about is about strategic plans. Many schools ask for more than one recommendation. One I was saying before, it's really about people who can provide context. So people who, recommenders who can talk about your experience with one project and use certain another project, another recommender. And so recommendations, I would say, anytime somebody submits a recommendation from a family, it's not very much value, because most of the time I think we can agree, not argue on this. Family members are obviously they want the best for you, and your recommenders do as well. Families are not going to be they're going to be able to sort of withdraw themselves from that close personal relationship enough to add that's going to add a lot of value. So what I would do is ask somebody who knows you outside of your family. It can be someone who has been on a project with you, someone who maybe level as you on a project, but has had the experience of working. You're adding more options to kind of a short list of recommenders. And absolutely hands down, clear family members. I think schools will agree that these types of recommendations do not add a lot of value to your recommendation, or sorry, to your application. Also, I would steer clear of people who do not know you well. So my second bullet point, or big bullet point here, is don't ask somebody just because of their title or because of their status within a company or an organization. While it may be impressive to you that they're a VP or a CEO or COO or whatever it is, their titles suggest, if they don't know you well and have not personally observed or worked with you, then I would say that's somebody to steer clear of in terms of approaching to their recommendation. when I see people who have asked a colleague who is of them, so I could ask a colleague of mine who maybe is also an assistant director on the admissions team, people to provide a lot more detailed and quality information on me as a status. A lot of times, the detailed information that the detailed recommendation are not going to be the same or somebody really well would be able to. So you want to ask people who reflection is a strong recommender. We also, a lot of recommendations are, again, supplemented by a form and also give the option of someone submitting a letter. Make sure that you make it clear to your recommender, maybe when you talk to them or via email, that you're going to send them a form and there's a couple boxes they might need to check off, in terms of, do you recommend this person? Rank their skill set here? If that's all that they're going to submit, that's also not very valuable. You want to be able to ask somebody who's going to actually sit down and write you a recommendation. It doesn't need to be pages long, but someone that is going to go a little bit beyond just sort of the generic boxes that a lot of recommendations require on the forms. So again, know somebody that knows you, your work, and your potential, and who's not just going to check a few boxes on a letterhead or write a 1 or 2 sentence recommendation letter, or someone who just has a great title. So again, my suggestion to you is to kind of take a step back and think about what skill sets or things that are important for the program that you're applying to that you want to convey to the admissions committee. And then think about who would best be able to illustrate that to the admissions committee. If schools are asking for more than one recommendation, think about those as a way to add different pieces of valuable information, and that each recommender can add something new, because there basically becomes a point of saturation. If a school asks for 2 or 3 recommendations and the 2 or 3 recommenders all say the same thing, yes, things are verified and consistent, which is great, but we want to also learn something new about you, hopefully from each recommender that you ask. So hopefully this strategic choices makes a little bit more sense now. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is this element of time. I had suggested before that 6 weeks is a really good idea to kind of start pursuing your recommenders. If you can do it ahead of time or a little bit more, maybe even 8 weeks ahead of time, that would be okay. If you go beyond, I would say 8 weeks before the recommendation is due, chances are someone's going to forget about it. I personally don't remember to do things 2 months ahead of time. 6 weeks is a little bit more manageable. A month is okay. I would say anything less than 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time, you're really kind of putting unnecessary pressure on your recommender. So I always sort of say there is a courtesy of ample time. Think about if somebody asks you to do something with a really short deadline, how that makes you sort of feel really frantic. It does the same exact thing to your recommender, especially when they're doing you a favor and you want them to do something that's a quality piece of prose or a writing recommendation. You want to give them sort of the luxury of having a little bit of time with a little bit of pressure so that they get it done. Again, when you're not relying on yourself, this is really important that you give them a little bit of space and you're cognizant of what they have going on, in terms of their responsibilities, and also, a way to sort of make this a little bit more manageable for them and for you is to kind of follow up with them as well, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So make this as easy for yourself and as easy for them as possible. Frantically scrambling to try and put together recommendations and recommenders, especially when you're relying on somebody else, is going to be really difficult. So just make sure that you're planning ahead of time. If this means pushing your application back to another deadline, that is also okay, because what you want to do is you don't want to submit an application just because. You want to submit it when it's at its best. So if this means that you need to give yourself a little bit more time to kind of meet the deadlines, then go ahead and do it. I would also say, and also in terms of, because you're relying on other people, you never know if something comes up. So have a plan B in terms of recommenders as well, so that you minimize the possibility of having to scramble to find a recommender. And that will also kind of cut back on this short-term deadline that you're trying not to give your recommenders. So the fourth thing I kind of wanted to touch about is this idea of waive your right. A lot of schools will ask you if you do you waive your right to see your recommendation. And so this basically, if you check the yes box, is saying that you had no influence, you did not see that recommendation, your recommender was able to sort of sit down, write it, and submit it without you having seen it, and you basically are trusting them. If you check the no box, which is it's fine as well. Some people choose to request a copy. They want to see the letter before it gets submitted. Just know that in terms of an admissions committee, for those people that do waive your right, we know that it is a lot more of an honest recommendation. Not that people are going to say terrible things about you, because again, the by virtue of sort of who you're asking and that they've agreed to write a recommendation, they're probably not going to be terrible recommendations. If anything, they'll be really positive. But I think recommenders themselves feel more comfortable when they know that you're not standing over their shoulder or reading what they have to say. So this kind of takes a little bit of pressure off of them, and that they can just be a lot more forthright and submit their letters straight to us when they're done with them. So it's just something to think about. Obviously, it's not something that will really be held against you if you say no, but it's something that I highly recommend. It adds an extra element of sort of honesty to your application, that it also verifies that your recommender was not sort of unduly influenced one way or the other. So that's kind of what I would recommend to you. If you are comfortable with that, definitely waive your right to reading your recommendation. The fifth thing I wanted to talk about is being honest. And I sort of mentioned that the last two are more or less common sense, but what a lot of schools are doing, because these days, because there's so much competition getting into business schools and MBA programs, is that schools are using outside vendors and outside websites to have resumes, essays, letters of recommendations checked by an outside resource for plagiarism and similarity to other recommenders and stuff like that. So just, you want to be as honest as possible. You don't want to copy and paste. So obviously this is something that, again, is common sense, but you wouldn't believe how many times schools come across things that are very questionable. So this is another way for us as an admissions committee to sort of figure out who you are as a recommender. So we want people who are going to be in the program who are going to be honest, and I'm sure other schools feel the same way. So also, when you're putting together your resume, when you're telling your recommenders about your intentions, when you're putting details of why you want to attend a program or a school, be honest, because anything that you say or they say can be questioned by an admissions committee, either as a follow-up to your application or even an interview. So if you say, for example, on your recommendation that you're fluent in Spanish, they could start asking you questions in Spanish. And if you don't understand them, then they know that you weren't being honest. So just think about things in that frame of mind, that you want to be as honest as possible, because if there are no sort of holdups on your applications or red flags or anything like that, that's always a plus. We don't want to have to police, but we also want to make you aware that because of experiences in the past and because of the competition, people will do anything to get into school. So just be as honest as possible. And so with that, I sort of say, it's okay to have weaknesses, and allow your recommenders to elaborate on them. I mean, obviously you're looking at business schools and MBA programs for an education. We don't expect that you're perfect. We don't expect that you've never had a failure or that you don't have a weakness. So just be completely honest with us, and a lot of times that will get you the farthest, more so than anything else. So just be completely honest with us, and also with your recommender as well, because again, things can really spiral out of control very quickly if you're not. And then last but not least, I think this is really important, is that following up is something that seems, again, very, very common sense, but a lot of people do not do it. In today's day and age, especially with a lot of things being electronic, many people don't take the time to be personal in this process. So you want to, again, with your recommender, you want to show them that you are organized, you want to be on top of your things, in terms of deadlines and keeping on your recommender, but not hounding them, and you want to follow up with them. So let's say you're 6 weeks out from a recommendation and you've approached your recommenders, you want to make sure that they don't forget about your submission. So you can follow up with them about a week or so, or maybe even 2 weeks before the deadline to give them a little bit of a nudge, especially if you can't track your recommendation or your letters of recommendation or your application online. Just make sure that they've done it. You could even ask them to send you an email when they've submitted it so that you can sort of, breathe a sigh of relief and know that that's one less thing you need to worry about in terms of getting your application in. And I would say, if at all possible, after your application is submitted, when you know everything is in, to write a handwritten personalized thank you note to your recommender. That goes a long way because they have taken the time away from doing something else to submit a recommendation on your behalf. It's really important to acknowledge what they've done for you and how much it means to you or how important it is. And how much you value what they have said and sort of vouching for you in this application process. So I think that's really important. This is something that's not done a lot these days. I can tell you that a lot of times people just send a generic thank you or nothing at all. And sometimes you want to know and have an acknowledgement that, what they did is valuable. So that's just kind of a little thing goes a long way, and this is definitely one of them. I also would, as an optional but a highly recommended sort of follow up, would be once you've heard back from the schools or even decided on which program you're going to attend, follow up with your recommenders and let them know that they were a big part of this process and that you're really excited to start. They want to know where their students have gone, especially the ones that have taken the time to go back and ask them for a recommendation. So, obviously the recommender is somebody that's really important. And so for you to identify them as a recommender, it gives them a lot of pleasure in sort of knowing that their students are having success after they've left their classroom, or in a workplace that after they've left, they've left a big impression on you. So follow up is extremely important. As a sort of side note to the follow up with before that you submit your recommendation and after you've approached your recommender, don't email them 10, 15, 20 times to make sure that they've done it because you're trying to be extremely, anal retentive or on top of things. Give them a little bit of space. Like I said, about a week or two before the submission deadline, follow up with them just to make sure that they've done that. So it's just more of a polite way to follow up and push them rather than kind of being on their shoulder all the time or even too much. So just make sure that you're very strategic about sort of your follow-up as well. So these are sort of the 6 tips for recommendations, and I kind of pulled these 6 tips from my experience on admissions committees. I think a lot of times when we have to, as an admissions person, spend time reading essays, looking at resumes, interviewing people, reading recommendations, when you get a recommendation that is just a bunch of boxes checked and not actually someone taking more than 30 seconds to do that, it doesn't add a lot of value. Additionally, again, when the recommender is not somebody that can vouch for you in a really valuable way in terms of sort of writing examples or reflecting on your experiences together, that is something that's really important as well. And those types of recommendations don't add a lot when they're not detailed enough. Again, there is a point where there's too much detail, but that's obviously not something in your control. And again, I think recommendations, because a lot of times people are quickly checking some boxes or not really writing valuable recommendations, they've sort of lost their value in the application process. But what I can tell you, and sort of talking to colleagues and also myself personally, recommendations are really important because they're a great way to sort of validate you and what you've been telling us, and lets us see you in a different light and also from somebody else's perspective. So kind of think about that as you sort of proceed through the application process, and think about creative ways or people that, if you're really struggling to think of recommendations, think about people that you've worked with at the same level. They don't always have to be a CEO. But think about people who can add some value to your application and really support you and what you've been saying in your application all along. So again, I'm Megan Solinger. I work in admissions. If you guys have any specific questions or follow-up questions, I just put my contact information for you there. But at this point, I'm going to open up to some question and answer. So feel free to write your questions in the chat box that you all have, and I will get to the questions that my presentation maybe didn't answer. So I see a couple of questions coming in. Let's see here. Okay, so in terms of professional recommendations, if you are someone who maybe has not been out in the professional working world for a really long time, it may be a little bit harder to get quote unquote these clear cut professional recommendations. So maybe you have to think back to when you were an undergraduate or a recent graduate, or maybe even some volunteer projects that you've been on or part of organizations that you've been part of. Absolutely, those would be wonderful, sort of creative, out of the box type of recommendations that I think would be really exciting to have as part of your application. So anybody who can really, if they're asking for professional recommendations, they want to know how you are working with other people, working in a professional setting. And volunteer organizations are really, really great examples of potentially leadership or really great involvement in the community. So I would say absolutely, if you're having trouble thinking of two professional recommendations, a volunteer organization would absolutely count. Potentially a leader, someone who is in a leadership position, or someone that you worked with very closely within that organization. Absolutely. So in terms of, because a lot of things nowadays are done electronically, preparing for your recommendations, it's not much different than sort of what I outlined here. The format between schools may be a little bit different, but the schools should each sort of highlight how that process is done. So I can speak to sort of how we do it here to give you an example. When you go in and fill out your recommendation, you type in an email address of your recommender, and a form gets sent to them. So if you ever have really specific questions about exactly what that form is or what that process is, you're always welcome to call the school. This is stuff that but make sure that you look on the website first would be my recommendation, just to show that you've done your homework. Just be like, I wasn't sure or wasn't clear on the website, can you clarify? But basically, I mean, a lot of the recommendations are asking the same questions but in a different format. So they should be relatively straightforward because not everybody has the same sort of technology savvy skills as others, especially when it comes to recommenders. So and most of the time they give detailed instructions, and I have yet to hear with our electronic version that people are having big problems with it. So I think that it's all about just knowing sort of that the questions and what we're asking is they're all going to sort of get at the same things, but maybe in a different format. So if you want, you potentially even call the school and ask them, if they have a copy of the recommendation form, or sometimes the websites, they do have a way for you to be able to download them just so you can see what they look like. So that would be a really good way to kind of, as a backup, to sort of see what that looks like. So sometimes when you're looking, so the question is about having recommenders write a draft. I don't see any problem with that. Obviously, again, this goes back to being honest, is that if you're going to write your own recommendation and they're going to quote unquote, sign off on it or sort of add an addendum to it, just make sure that it is honest and that you're not making things up. I think probably the weirdest thing is, having to sit down and write about yourself. I personally have a lot of trouble with that. So having to sit down and actually write a recommendation that you're going, or write something that you're going to give to your recommender that you've written about yourself is always a little bit weird. But if you're following, as I said before, think about sort of what skill set or experience you want this recommender to sort of be getting at or help add value to your application by highlighting. You should sort of approach it in that sense, and it will hopefully make it a little bit less weird. Sit down and write down a couple of points or the skills and think about how that person has seen you work in that capacity. So if you're trying to convey that you're a good communicator or that you're organized, how did that person sort of experience that or observe you in that capacity? Or did you work on them with a project? What were some of the things that you guys worked through together? So kind of ask yourself a question as to sort of, what is this recommender trying to add to my application? And that should make it a little bit easier. But some recommenders, that's what they ask you to do, and if it's not wrong, and some schools and that's one of the sort of ways that people do recommendations. There's forms, there's letters. Sometimes it's writing yourself your own recommendation and handing that off to your recommender. But make sure they read it and tell them that they can definitely augment it if need be. So the question's about thank you gifts for recommenders. If you're applying to multiple schools, and you're paying all these application fees, potentially even traveling, things can get really expensive. So what I would recommend is, I don't think it's necessary that you buy them anything per se. If you do, keep it very minimal. I think gifts, under $10 are perfectly fine. And I think recommenders really do understand that, this isn't about procuring a gift at the end. It's about doing something for somebody else and seeing, their former student or colleague have success. So even a recommendation, a handwritten, really nice note that, is personal, I think is perfectly acceptable, rather than feeling that you have to buy gifts for people. If it's someone that you're really close to and they've done a lot of things for you over the years, I mean, that's maybe a little bit different, but I would say, a $5, $10 Starbucks gift card, or something really minimal. I think you don't really need to go and buy extravagant gifts. If anything, like I said, I really think that personal thank you note is something that most people don't receive these days. So that I think that can kind of be the gift. And if you use them for any other resources or lots of resources over the years or in the future, I think maybe at that point you can potentially buy them a little something nicer. But I don't think this is about buying gifts for people who are doing you favors. So the next question is about if you're going off to school and leaving for a job, if you don't have a letter of recommendation from your current supervisor, that's perfectly fine. And why I say that is because a lot of people do private, or they just sort of do private searches, or this is their personal life. It has no reflection on their job, and a lot of people don't want to be perceived in a different way in their work environment. So it's the same thing when you're looking for a new job. You don't always disclose that. And it's not that you're being sneaky or anything like that, but you just, many things can happen along the way. So what I would say in this case is that if you're not able to ask your current supervisor, ask yourself if there's someone that you feel comfortable with, who that maybe other than your supervisor, someone that you've worked with in this current job who might be a good recommender, who aren't going to blab to your supervisor or your boss. If that's not something that's comfortable with you or doesn't resonate well with you either, my other recommendation would be to, it's perfectly fine, but just make sure that you highlight in maybe the additional essay or space on the application why you are not asking a current supervisor or a current coworker to submit a recommendation on your behalf. That you're doing a private search and that you didn't want to be treated any differently at work, or whatever the case may be. Just be completely honest and just let us know why, and then that should be enough, because a lot of people are in the same situation. So it's not abnormal to not have a current recommender, but just let us know why. So the next question is about the person who is writing your recommendation and having poor writing skills. This is why I think a lot of schools also ask for a form with check boxes, because it sort of supplements maybe what people aren't able to write in their recommendation as clearly, or just kind of really supplements what they've been trying to say. Obviously this is not a reflection on you. I would say that the thing that I would worry about, or just make sure you convey to them, is getting the school's name correct. I've seen a lot of recommendations where the writing skills have not been that great, and as long as we can understand what they're trying to get at, that's fine. And make sure that they submit that form, because in that case it would be really important to kind of have both. I would say the biggest issue is someone who's not paying attention to detail and writes something about the wrong school. That has a bad reflection. But in terms of the poor writing skills, obviously that's not a reflection on you. And for a lot of people, because a lot of schools have an international student basis these days, a lot of the recommenders, English is their second language. And so we kind of, I don't want to say take it with a grain of salt, but we understand that there's going to be some writing discrepancies and some errors and that kind of stuff. So again, as long as we can get the gist and understand what they're trying to say about you, and that they know you well enough, if that comes across successfully, then it's okay. And then that's a good recommendation. So the next question is in the same vein, in the sense that asking someone who does not speak English, um, that's a tricky question. But I would say that in this case, if your recommenders do not speak English, if there's somebody else that can translate them, who's going to, which again sort of goes along the lines of sort of waiving your right and also being more honest, having somebody else do it is probably going to be um, a little bit easier than you trying to figure out what they're trying to say. Again, you're reading their recommendations. So my suggestion is if you have somebody else who can translate those for you and submit them, submit the recommendations, that's fine. If you do not have that person or those resources, then just explain in, again, a lot of schools give you the space to write an additional essay or give us more information that maybe we don't ask in the application. Just let us know sort of what the circumstances are, because again, this is something that does come up. Um, and so not everybody has the resources or everybody has the language skills to be able to write the recommendations in English or whatever language it is. So do the best you can with what you have, and if that means that you have to translate your recommendations, so be it. But just let us know that that's what you had to do. So so the next question is about if you're not able to get a direct supervisor to write a recommendation, and how is someone who is a peer rather than a direct supervisor, how is it ranked or weighted? And so I kind of touched on this before. It's not necessarily looked at any worse. It's not looked at as a lower recommendation. It's not given any less weight than having your direct supervisor. As long as you explain to us, and it can be very briefly, why you're not asking your current supervisor or why you're asking this particular person, or let them put that in context for you. Again, they have to explain maybe how they know you and why they're a good recommender. Let them do that in their letter, but it's not viewed upon to us and to other coworkers that I've talked to, and other admissions people from other schools. I can't speak for every school, but I can tell you that, we want somebody that knows you well and who can reflect on you. So unless a school says that it has to be from a direct supervisor, I think you have the liberty to kind of pick and choose a peer, somebody from an outside organization. You have a lot of flexibility in who those professional recommenders are. So the next question is about sort of deadlines. So if your deadline is, let's say, after the New Year's, and let's see. So, and then the recommendation, you ask your recommender. So it looks like if your deadline is January 10th and you ask your recommender to submit the letter December 15th, so they're not working over the new year, is that too soon for the school to hold on to your recommendation? So I can, again, really only speak to the Carey Business School, but we will take letters of recommendation months ahead of time, if someone submits them, and we hold on to them, at least here at the Carey Business School, until we have the application, then and all the other pieces, and we match things up as we kind of receive them. So for us, we hold on to sort of, as I would call them, like a rogue recommendation that doesn't necessarily have an application. So let's say you're still working on your application, but your recommender's already submitted. We'll hold on to that. I can't say that that's how all the other schools sort of work, but know that most schools will probably hold on to things and match them up as they get them. But it's really actually pretty considerate of you to not make them have to work over the new year or over the holidays. Just make sure, that you're not forgetting about following up with them, or that you're kind of making things more confusing for yourself by doing it that way. But I think it's absolutely fine to have recommenders submit things ahead of time. Just keep track of everything that everything that's being submitted, so that you do have a completed application by the deadline. So do schools have a process to verify the authenticity of recommenders? Not necessarily. Basically, I mean, obviously, if there's something that's in question, we have the right to contact the person. We have the right to contact you, to question things. So most of the time, again, like I said, a lot of schools are also doing plagiarism checks and that kind of stuff, which is also another way to see if, this is really who this person is. Again, if an email doesn't bounce back or email bounces back or anything like that, if we have questions, I mean, there are red flags that schools sort of keep an eye out for in terms of the verification process. But again, this goes back to having an honest recommendation. If we see something that is, I would call it a red flag, we may investigate it. So you definitely don't want to find yourself in that position where we're questioning you, your recommender, or anything that has to do with your application, because to us, that basically is taking away your credibility and really kind of the type of person that most schools are looking for into their programs. They want people who are very forthright. So don't do anything to jeopardize yourself in this process. But a lot of times that's why when we say waive your right, that's one way that we can sort of vaguely verify the authenticity of the recommendations because it's coming directly from the recommender. So for the next question is about, is it appropriate for someone who's still in school to ask a professor? If the school that you're applying to says specifically that they're looking for professional recommendations, then obviously not a hard and steady rule that no, a professor is not an appropriate recommender, but I would say get 2 professional recommendations. Think about leadership, think about volunteer experiences that you've had within the past couple of years that are relevant, and those are probably more appropriate in terms of being professional recommendations. If you're also still in school, maybe you could have an additional recommendation, maybe one come from a professor because you are still a student. So that would obviously be someone who knows you in that capacity and sort of in your current role as a student. So if a school, what I would say, if a school says that they require 2 professional recommendations, make sure that you follow those rules. This is another way that schools kind of keep track of candidates. When it comes down to it at the end, if you followed all the directions, you're probably in better shape than somebody who did not. So don't submit, a professor recommendation and a professional when they ask for 2 professionals. I would say first and foremost, get those 2 professionals, and then check with the school if you're allowed to sort of augment or submit an additional recommendation, potentially from a professor. So that would be my recommendation. So the next question is about demonstrating diversity or background experience. Is it good to have recommendations from people in various locations or of different cultures other than you yourself, the applicant? Obviously, I think if that's something that the school values and something that, is really important to the program and or important to you, then that would be a wonderful thing to do, especially as, we're talking about business school recommendations now and applying to business schools. This idea of globalization and sort of international business is something that sort of is part of most programs these days. You really can't get away from it. So I think that's a really valuable thing to convey to an admissions committee, that you understand different cultures or backgrounds. But I don't think necessarily that if you have 2 people from the same cultural background or geographic location, that your application is going to be any weaker than someone, who has varied recommendations. So know that it's really kind of a personal preference, but I think that's something that is you could definitely do something with that. You could, in terms of adding a lot of value to your application, if that's something that's important to you and or to the school or program you're applying to. So in terms of the length of recommendation, I didn't really touch on this in the sense that I don't think there's any, sort of cutoff point in terms of word limit that would be too short or too long. But I would say, someone can write a recommendation in 2 or 3 sentences. It's probably not going to hold much value. But at the same time, if somebody writes a single-space 3-page letter, the admissions committees or the person reading your application probably is going to roll their eyes and say, this is a bit long. The person could have been a little bit more succinct. Think about it in that sense. Ask them to maybe answer a particular question. If they know you extensively, tell them that you're really trying to have them reflect on a particular skill, and that will help them sort of draw in their experiences and the length of that recommendation. So you don't want it to be pages and pages long, because at some point, if everybody did that, that's going to be way too much for the admissions committee to be able to read, and you kind of lose our interest. So I would say, if I were to give you sort of a page limit, I would say a page is probably the maximum. I think people can get it done in a couple of paragraphs if they're really to the point and have some really good examples. But a couple of sentences is also, at the same time, a little bit too short. Some schools also give you, they might give you some word limits or some constrictions like that or restrictions. So just make sure you pay attention. Every school is very different and they have the right to sort of make up their own rules and restrictions and that kind of stuff. So just make sure you pay close attention to what those might be. So in terms of getting a recommendation from a customer, a partner, or a vendor, I think absolutely. If that's someone that you've worked with who can really speak to you as a professional, if that's the type of recommendation that you're going for, I think that's absolutely a very valid and valuable recommender to pursue. So I think that that's a great idea if that's someone that you want to add to your sort of list of recommenders. So in terms of the length, so how relevant does someone have to be in terms of the length of time for them to be a recommender? I don't think there's any cutoff point. Obviously, if it's someone who you worked with 5, 10, 15 years ago, but you've kept in touch with them and didn't really just kind of pop back up on their radar, I think that you could potentially ask them to be a recommender. If it's someone you haven't talked to in 5, 10, 15 years, it's probably not going, they probably need a lot more. They probably know someone who is not the same person who's applying to the program today. But if there's a certain skill set or something unique about that job or experience that you had that you think only that recommender can really reflect on, then I think it's totally appropriate to ask someone who you haven't worked with in quite a while. But I think if you haven't worked with someone for 5, 10, 15 years and haven't kept in touch, it's probably not someone that knows you well enough or knows your current self well enough to be a good, valuable recommender. But if it's someone you've kept in touch with or it's only been a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, I think you're fine. And in terms of discussing weaknesses, that's the next question. You don't have to discuss weaknesses. Sometimes there'll be a short answer on recommendation forms that says, does this person have any weaknesses? Again, if you have weaknesses, this may be something you can discuss in your interview if schools ask them of you. But basically, I don't think you need to point out that you have weaknesses and have them write about them. Again, this comes with the candidness of someone writing a recommendation when you waive your right. If there's something they want to talk about as a weakness, but something that you've improved on, that's a great thing for a recommender to talk about. Maybe when you started working with this person, you were very shy and reserved, and then all of a sudden you were, over the course of the number of years or the project that you worked on, you came out of your shell and they showed that you developed. That's really what we want to see. We want to see you in a professional setting, and that's something that a recommender is going to write about, then let them. But I wouldn't say tell them to specifically write about a weakness, but let them bring that up. Most of the time, as I would say, recommendations are very positive. And even if they do discuss a weakness, recommenders usually do talk about how someone improved upon things or worked through troubled times or a hard, some failure and then really kind of changed because of it. So that's really kind of the tone of a lot of recommendations. They're not meant to be to bring you down or to really, really critique you. So the next question is about how much weight do recommendation letters play in the overall admissions decision? So one of the first things I mentioned when this presentation started was that the admissions committees are very strategic about what they ask for because everything has a weight or a value in terms of getting to know you as an applicant. So that's why it's really important that your recommenders can really add that value to your application. Could I give you a sort of percentage or an exact ratio of this to that in terms of the application pieces? No, not really. But I would say don't neglect them. Don't just, again, ask family members or ask people for the sake of asking them, but ask people who are really going to reflect on you and really kind of, promote you as a great candidate for the program because of their experience with you. So recommendations definitely do have a weight in the application process. I think that, I speak from sort of my experience. We ask for everything, we read everything. Even if you do submit sort of multiple recommendations or you do have an additional lengthy letter in there, we read everything because we want to find out as much about you as we possibly can. And I think recommenders are a really great way to have something in terms of your character and your skill set that a transcript doesn't necessarily convey to us, or that you weren't able to capture completely in an essay or something like that. So recommendations definitely do have some weight in the overall decision. Obviously, if it's something, someone talks about a skill set and we're really worried about it, something we talk to you about in an interview. So that's also another way that we can find out more about you and your potential fit for our program. The next question is about applying to multiple schools. Is it too much to ask one recommender to do recommendation letters? If you know that they're going to be a great resource, a great recommendation, I don't think 5 is too many. If that's the case, make sure that you lay out very specifically when those deadlines are so that they can prioritize. Maybe upfront let them know that you have multiple applications with multiple deadlines and that here are the 2 that have the most priority. And again, when you're giving them that sort of cover letter in terms of why you're interested in a particular school and or a particular program, let them know which ones are your top choice, their top choices, and that could also help them as well. If it's a school that you've been talking to them about for many, many years, see that's what you want to convey to them. But I think most people these days are not applying to 1 or 2 schools, they're applying to a handful of schools. So it's sort of to expect that if they write a recommendation for one school, that it can probably be reworked and really kind of adapted to another school so that, the legwork really is in kind of doing the first recommendation. So I don't think it's inappropriate to ask them to do multiple recommendations. Just make sure you're very organized and upfront with them about sort of the timeline that they're looking at. So the next question that I'm going to answer is about advice for reapplicants. I would say that if you already applied and you either did not get into a program or you weren't able to enroll for whatever reason or circumstances, and you're reapplying to a program, I would say since you applied last time, what has changed to make you a better or a different applicant this time? If it means that you've had a different job or experience, then you need to update your recommendations. And so that's kind of how I would look at this process. What has changed and made you a different or a better candidate this time around than last time? And so if you've had some amazing experience, even if you've traveled or did something quote unquote not necessarily related to the program, there's probably some skill set or something different about you and what you've done that you can have highlighted in a new application letter of recommendation or letter of recommendations. So that's kind of how I view the letters of recommendation as a reapplicant. If you're going to ask the same person, I mean, it's okay to leave some of the same recommendations, but I would say, again, you want them to know why they should be reconsidering when maybe things didn't turn out so well last time. So if it means that that you've had another job, another year of experience, that's all really wonderful things that you could probably get a new recommender to elaborate on. So we only have time for about 2 more questions, so if you have them, let us know what they are. So the next question I'm going to answer is about, the question is, if I'm an older applicant, is there a different strategy for leveraging your recommendations for your application? So I'm assuming if you're sort of what we're calling an older applicant, that you've had probably more years of experience than someone who maybe is 1, 2, 3, 4 years out of undergraduate or some other academic setting or program. In that case, you're kind of at an advantage, especially if you're looking at a professional program. You can really kind of leverage those relationships that you had with vendors, with coworkers, with supervisors, whether they're current or previous. But I would say that you probably don't want to go back too far. So I think that you can it can be a little detrimental if you're older and you ask somebody who you haven't worked with for 10 years, because you're probably a very different person and applicant if you had applied 10 years ago than you would be now. So I would say that I think there's a lot of potential to have really, really strong recommendations. It's a matter of picking and choosing which ones those are going to be. So I think that you have a harder job in sort of narrowing that list down, but not going back too far that you are missing out on some of the more relevant experiences that you've had currently. And so in sort of that same vein about being an older applicant or maybe being a non-traditional applicant or being someone who is applying to a business school right out of undergrad, if that's the case, I strongly believe, and I think many people would agree with this, that every applicant brings something different to the table. So if you think about how or who or what you want to convey to the admissions committee, you want them to know why you'd be a great fit for that program. So, is it because of your years of experience? Is it because you're straight out of undergrad? Is it because of what is it that makes you unique and why this would be a good program and fit for you and for them? So I think that's kind of another way to think about leveraging your recommendations in those relationships. What do you want to get across to the admissions committee? So the next question, and this will probably be our last question, is about recommendations from people like a social worker or a political activist or something like that. If they know you in a professional setting, I think it's absolutely appropriate for them to be a recommender on